It was my 72nd birthday, and I had spent the whole day preparing for it. Ironic, isn't it? A birthday that was mine in name only. Yet I was the one scrubbing the counters, setting the table, and stirring the stew. I even made that almond cake they all used to love when they were little, back when they'd sit around my feet in the kitchen stealing spoonfuls of frosting when they thought I wasn't looking. But that day the house didn't hum with childhood laughter or the clatter of helping hands. It was quiet, too quiet. Just me and the ticking of the old wall clock, the one my husband hung the year we moved in. They came, of course, not all at once and not on time, but they came. My oldest swept in first cell phone still glued to his ear, gave me a distracted peck on the cheek, and went straight for the wine. His wife followed, sighing, commenting on how tired she was, how stressful her week had been. She passed the gifts to me without looking up, still replying to a work email. The others arrived in similar fashion. Light hugs, half-hearted smiles, a chorus of happy birthday, sung more like an afterthought than a celebration. Dinner passed with idle chatter. They talked mostly to each other about promotions, vacation plans, renovations on homes I'd never been invited to see. No one asked me about my day or what I had been up to lately. I nodded along spooned food onto their plates, refilled drinks when glasses emptied. I smiled when someone joked that my stew tastes just like childhood, but inside something was stirring. It wasn't anger yet, just emptiness, an awareness, a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty window. When the cake came out, they clapped and sang, and one of them even took a video for social media. 72, and still baking, like a champ, someone said. I laughed on cue, but as I looked around that table, surrounded by the people I had given my whole life to, birthdays, planned injuries, nurse tuition paid, I realized I wasn't really with them. I was serving them, feeding them, supporting them, and in return they had offered me attendance, not love, not gratitude, just presence, like showing up was a favor. After the cake, they started drifting toward the door. "Thanks for dinner, Mom. We'll call you next week. Take care of yourself." The goodbyes were quick, casual. No one stayed to help clean up. No one even asked if I needed help. Plates stacked high in the sink, scraps still on the table, and I was left standing in the aftermath of my own birthday party like the hostess at a wedding, where the bride forgot to say thank you. I remember sitting down in the kitchen chair once the last door had closed, the silence collapsing around me. I stared at the empty plates and smeared forks and wondered, how had we become this? When did I start being invisible? Or had I always been and just refused to see it? I didn't cry that night, but I didn't sleep either. I kept hearing their voices, not for what they said, but for what they didn't. No. "How are you holding up, Mom? No. Do you need help with anything?" Just stories about themselves. Photos of their new kitchens, news about their kids, my grandchildren, whose games and plays I hadn't been invited to. That birthday marked the beginning, though I didn't know it yet, the beginning of a slow unraveling, of questions that wouldn't leave me alone, of memories knocking on the walls of my heart, asking if I was truly as loved as I had always believed. The morning after the dinner, I woke to the smell of old food and something even heavier, disappointment, the kind that lingers in the chest like damp air in an old house. I shuffled into the kitchen, my slippers whispering across the floor, and looked at the remnants of what was supposed to be a celebration. Crusted plates stacked high, cake crumbs hardened on the tablecloth, a half-empty wine bottle tipped on its side. Everything was still there, untouched, like they had vanished without a trace of care. I washed dishes in silence. I've done it 1,000 times. But that day, each clink of a plate, each pass of the sponge felt like an echo of their absence. Their voices still rang faintly in my ears, Compliments that were shallow gestures, that were mechanical. They brought gifts, yes, but nothing personal. One gave me a scented candle, another a pair of socks still in their supermarket wrapping. Not a single card, not one written note, not one moment where they really looked at me. It made me think of birthdays past, the ones when I was younger, when my husband was still alive, and the house vibrated with chaos. Homemade cards from sticky toddler hands, burnt pancakes. In bed, confetti in my shoes. There was effort back then. Love took the form of imperfect surprises, messy but heartfelt. Now everything is clean and cold, polished on the surface, hollow inside. Later that day, I folded the paper bag. One of the gifts came in and tucked it into the drawer. An old habit, I always save bags just in case. But this time it felt like I was preserving something brittle, a fake memory, a gesture that didn't mean what it used to. I stood there, staring into the drawer, realizing I was saving not out of hope, but out of reflex. Reflexes born from decades of giving and giving, even when there was nothing left to give. By afternoon, I was sitting in the living room blanket draped over my knees, television murmuring in the background. I tried to watch an old movie I used to love, but my mind kept drifting. I thought about the birthday cards I had written for them, each one filled with handwritten notes folded with care, sealed with a kiss. I thought about the gifts I used to make, crocheted scarves, photo albums, little boxes filled with their childhood keepsakes, things I had saved so they wouldn't have to. I wondered not for the first time if they ever noticed, if they ever really saw me not as the person who made things happen, but as a person who needed to. I'm not talking about money or help with the lawn. I mean recognition, eye contact, questions like, how are you sleeping? Or, are you happy? But no, they just arrive, eat and leave. The rhythm is as predictable as the tide, and I like the shoreline I'm left eroded and quiet. That evening, I pulled out the family photo album, not the digital kind. They never liked the old albums, but the one I kept on the lower shelf of the bookcase, the one I always dusted but rarely opened. Page after page of tiny hands, gripping mine, of birthday candles blown out by cheeks puffed in joy, of Christmas mornings and messy hair. Their eyes used to shine so brightly when they looked at me. But even in those photos, there were signs. I was always behind the camera, or blurry in the background, or cropped at the edges. I had trained myself to frame them perfectly. I had edited myself out. And now they return the favor. I sat with that album on my lap for hours, not crying, just remembering, letting the warmth of those years burn quietly in the chest. They were real. The love I gave it was real. But the way it faded, that was real too. And it was starting to feel like maybe I had mistaken their dependency for devotion. Maybe they weren't ungrateful children. Maybe they were just grown adults who never learned how to look back. That night, when I finally turned out the lights, I left one lamp on in the hallway, not out of fear, but out of habit. I used to leave it on for them, so they could find their way if they ever came late, so they wouldn't trip or feel alone. But lately the hallway stayed empty, and the light, well, maybe it wasn't for them anymore. Maybe it was for me, so I could see what I'd been missing all this time. 2 days later, I got a group text my son had started a new job. My daughter-in-law was overwhelmed with the kids, and the youngest had so much on her plate that she might not call for a while. I read it 3 times, trying to find something beneath the words. A question for me, perhaps. A thank you. A follow-up about the dinner. Nothing. Just declarations of busyness, as if I were one more task they needed to apologize for not completing. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, tea cooling in my hands, watching the steam fade like my sense of connection. They speak often, yes. They share updates. but they don't check in. It's all performance. They tell me about their bosses, their children's achievements, the new car lease, the leak in the bathroom ceiling information, not intimacy. And when I offer something about my own life, there's always a beat of silence, a pause, then a change of subject as though my words were background noise too quiet to notice. It's not that I expect grand gestures. I never did. I raised them to be independent, strong-willed, self-sufficient. But I didn't raise them to forget. I didn't raise them to treat me like a voice on the other end of a phone, convenient only when something breaks or they need someone to watch the kids. And yet that's what I had become, a soft place to land when life got inconvenient. The problem is I never showed them I had boundaries. I never said no. I remember a moment not long after my husband passed when I needed help reorganizing the garage. I didn't want to call a stranger. I just wanted someone familiar to be there with me, lifting old boxes and walking through memories that still smelled of his aftershave. I asked if any of them could come by that weekend. Each one said the same thing in slightly different ways. Wish I could, but I've just got so much going on. So I did it myself. Carried the bins with shaking arms, sorted the tools with aching knees. When I dropped a box and heard something crack, I sat on the cold garage floor and waited for the wave of pain to pass, not from the fall, but from the realization that I had become an afterthought. I never told them about that day, because mothers don't want to guilt their children. We don't want to be a burden. We bite our tongues. We smile when they say, "We'll visit soon," and we pretend not to notice that soon means maybe next holiday. Maybe. Sometimes they ask how I'm doing, but it's always squeezed in between other sentences. Hope you're doing well anyway. The kids have been driving me crazy. Or, things good with you, by the way. Do you still have Grandpa's old tools? Their inquiries are bookmarks, not invitations. And I've learned not to answer too truthfully, because when I did once or twice, I could feel them squirm on the other end, uncomfortable, eager to pivot. So I give them what they want, lip service. I say I'm fine. I say the garden is blooming and the dog is doing better, and the neighbors are sweet. I smile through the phone. I say things to ease their guilt, though they never ask me to. And maybe that's the saddest part. I preempt their discomfort. I clear the emotional path so they can walk through me without noticing they've stepped on something sacred. I kept a notebook for a while, small, tucked in the kitchen drawer. I used to write grocery lists in it, but it slowly became a journal. I wrote down things I wanted to tell them, moments I wanted to share. The first rose bloom in spring, the way the sunrise lit up the kitchen wall like honey, a memory of their father's voice when he sang while shaving. I filled pages with things that no one asked to hear. Sometimes I wonder what they would say if they ever read it. Would they even recognize the woman in those entries? Or has the image of me become so one-dimensional, so wrapped up in utility that they'd be surprised? I have thoughts that ache to be seen. I placed the notebook back in the drawer that night beneath the scissors and rubber bands. It's safer there, safer than hoping. Because hoping for something that's been drained dry only leads to resentment. And I don't want to resent them. I really don't. But even love has its limits when it's never refilled. It was a Tuesday. Nothing special, nothing urgent. Just one of those mundane, practical needs that creeps up on you when you live alone. I had run out of egg sugar and the kind of tea I like to sip in the evenings when the house goes still. My joints had been bothering me more than usual that week, especially my knees. The idea of driving, parking, walking the length of the store, only to lift bags back into the trunk, felt like too much. So I called my son. I asked gently, not wanting to sound needy, just wondering if he might be passing by the market. "It's nothing urgent," I said. "Just if you're already going." He told me he was headed out that way and would gladly pick them up. I thanked him twice just to make sure I didn't sound demanding. Then I waited. By late afternoon, I had set out a little basket on the counter ready for the groceries. I boiled water, preparing for tea I didn't have, and stared out the window as clouds passed over the garden. The evening came and went. No knock at the door. No message, just silence. The next morning, I sent a soft follow-up text. "Did you get a chance to stop by the store yesterday?" A few hours later, he replied, I'm so sorry. Totally forgot. It's been a crazy week." And that was it. No offer to bring it today. No call. No voice filled with concern. Just 3 lines of text and a trail of excuses. I stood in the kitchen reading it over and over again. My hands felt strangely still, as if they'd forgotten what to do with themselves. I wasn't angry. I was hollow, forgotten like the groceries. I ended up walking to the store that afternoon, taking it slow, one aching step at a time. I used the old canvas bag I keep by the door, the one fraying at the handles. Every aisle felt longer than usual. Every item I reached for reminded me I was doing this alone, not because I had to, but because someone chose not to remember. When I got home, I placed the eggs in the fridge, lined the tea boxes in the cupboard, and wiped the sugar canister before refilling it. All small tasks, but they felt heavy with meaning. I thought about how many years I had carried their needs, when they had colds, when they forgot assignments, when they lost shoes or dreams or hearts. I never once forgot, not once, not when it mattered. And yet here I was, an afterthought in my own life. Later that week, my daughter called. She didn't ask how I'd been, didn't ask about the groceries. She talked about a new yoga class she loved, about how exhausted she was from work. She said, "Sometimes I wish I had your quiet life." Mom, and laughed like it was a compliment. Quiet life. It echoed in me like a hollow drum. What she saw as peace was really neglect dressed in silence. There's a difference between solitude and being unseen, between choosing quiet and having it pressed into your skin like a bruise. I hung up with a polite goodbye and sat there in my chair, hands folded over my lap like I used to do in church. I stared at the sugar bowl on the table. It was full now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside me was running empty. I used to think that forgetting was innocent, that people got busy, that they meant well. But as time passed, I started to realize not remembering is its own kind of choice. You remember what you value. You return to what you care for. You don't forget what roots you, unless those roots are buried beneath something else, something louder, shinier, easier. And I had become too easy to forget. That night, I didn't make tea. I didn't read. I just sat, in the stillness, in the weight of that invisible kind of grief, the kind you don't cry, over the kind you carry like a quiet ache behind the ribs. It started with the bulb flickering overhead, that little hallway light outside the storage room that had been blinking for months, ignored like so many small things in this house. I decided one morning on a strange wave of energy that I would finally go in and sort the space out, maybe change the bulb, maybe let go of the clutter. That room hadn't been opened in years. It was where I tucked away the past, the things too heavy for memory but too sacred to throw away. I pushed the door open and a breath of dust greeted me like an old sigh. The light sputtered once, then died entirely. So I brought in the old lamp from the sewing room and plugged it in. The beam was soft and warm, casting long shadows across the boxes, stacked like tombstones of former lives. I stood in the middle, unsure where to begin. The first box I opened was labeled school papers. Inside were report cards, crayon drawings, class photos. One had a scribbled note on the back, "Homie, you make me feel brave." My throat tightened. I sat cross-legged on the cold floor and flipped through decades of proof that I had once been needed. Not just tolerated, not just visited, needed. One envelope held the first tuition bill I paid for my daughter's university. It had a yellow sticky note on it in my own handwriting. First semester, she doesn't know I covered it all. I smiled at the memory. She had cried when she thought she got the scholarship. I never told her the truth. I just let her believe in magic. Let her think the world gave her what she wanted. That's what mothers do. Another box contained wedding gifts I had helped purchase carefully. Selected, lovingly wrapped, funded by savings that were never replenished. There was a receipt for a deposit I made on a honeymoon suite because they were short on cash that year. They had promised to pay me back. They never did. But I never asked. That felt tacky. That's the strange thing about generosity. It becomes invisible the moment it's received. Once given, it no longer belongs to the giver, not even in memory. I found thank you cards too, some handwritten, some generic. But reading them now, they felt hollow, as if they were more about formality than feeling. "Thanks for everything," Mom one said. "You're the best." No specifics. No mention of the long nights I sat up sewing hems, the phone calls I answered at 2 a.m., the meals I packed when they forgot to eat. I realized then they had always seen the result, but never the labor. As I dug deeper into the room, I came across a rusted tin box tucked into the corner. Inside were scraps of paper, tiny folded notes my husband had once written me. Some had grocery lists. Others just said things like, "Pick up dry cleaning" or "Don't forget the apples." But tucked between them was one that read, "You hold this family together like the spine of a book." I pressed it against my chest and closed my eyes. That's what I had been all along the spine. Not the cover, not the illustration they show off to the world, not even the pages they reread for comfort. Just the quiet binding that keeps everything from falling apart. And now, they no longer needed binding. That day I packed half the boxes for donation. Old linens, clothes from 20 years ago, frames I never hung. But I kept the notes. I kept the tuition bills. I kept the receipts not for the money, but for the memory of what I had given. Proof that I had mattered once. As I closed the last box, my knees ached and my back throbbed. But there was a strange peace settling inside me. Not joy, not triumph, but truth. A truth I had been too busy or too frightened to see. They didn't remember because they didn't have to. I made their lives smooth, seamless. I erased the effort, and in doing so, I erased myself. That night I sat with a glass of warm milk and looked at the tidy stack of labeled boxes, each one a small tombstone of a moment I had quietly let go. I thought of the inheritance they all assumed was coming the way they spoke of it, like a built-in reward, as if being born entitled them to the rest of me, as if I owed them one last gesture. But looking at those receipts, those crayon drawings, those folded notes, I began to question whether the last gesture should belong to them at all. It's funny what you start to notice when your eyes finally open, not with bitterness, but with clarity. I began paying closer attention after that day in the storage room, watching, listening, not for what they said, but for what they didn't. Silence can be louder than words when you finally hear it right. They had jobs now, good ones. Some even had second homes, new cars, children in private schools. I never begrudged them their success. Why would I? I had worked hard so they could rise higher than I ever did. That was the point of all my sacrifice. But what I didn't expect was how easily they forgot what that rise had cost me. They called less, visited less, but the requests never stopped. One needed help covering a gap in daycare. Another asked for a loan for dental work. The youngest wanted to know if I still had the old treadmill. And could she store it at my house, which really meant keep it here indefinitely? Each time they asked, they used a soft tone always couched in compliments. "You're just so good at managing things, Mom. You're always there for us. It's just until things settle down." But things never settled down. They had grown into people who assumed my help was a constant, like the sun rising or rain in spring. I was expected to say yes because I always had. And when I paused, when I dared hesitate even for a second, I could hear the chill creep into their voices, subtle, disappointed, as if I had broken an unspoken contract. I remember one afternoon my middle child came over unannounced. She stood in the entryway holding a large bag of laundry. Her machine had broken and she just needed to do a quick load. She kissed my cheek, dumped the clothes in the washer, and disappeared into her phone for an hour while I folded her kids' socks. "No, thank you. No. Can I help?" She left as quickly as she came, saying, "You're a lifesaver, Mom," and drove off while I stood in the doorway with a basket full of damp clothes. And I let her. Not because I couldn't say no, but because saying no would have shattered the illusion I had clung to for decades that being useful was the same as being loved. I started keeping track in my mind. Little things, the birthdays they missed, the appointments I went to alone, the groceries they never offered to carry. I told myself it was petty childish even to tally these things, but I couldn't help it. When your life becomes a series of unpaid favors, a ledger naturally forms in your heart, not because you want revenge, but because you start to wonder if you've ever truly been seen at all. I once paid their bills without hesitation, covered rent when jobs were lost, let them borrow my credit card during the holidays. But when I hinted gently that my roof might need repairs soon, or that I'd been skipping the dentist to save money, they changed the subject. Or worse, they looked at me like I was being dramatic. "You've always managed," one said. "You're strong, Mom," as if strength was something I could spend, like currency. But strength, too, has limits. One evening I sat in the garden with my notebook, the one I'd turned into a kind of secret journal. I wrote the words that had been echoing in my chest for weeks. They take because I taught them they could. It wasn't a cry for pity. It was a confession. I had built this house of giving with my own hands. I had taught them to come to me when things were hard, but never taught them to come to me when things were calm. Never taught them to come back just because. And now, they didn't know how. That same night, a neighbor's teenage son came over to return a casserole dish. He stayed for a few minutes, told me about his exam results, even asked how I'd been. A boy barely 17 asking with more sincerity than my own children had in months. When he left, he said, "Thanks again, Mrs. B. You always make people feel like home." I stood at the door long after he was gone, holding the empty dish to my chest, like it held something sacred. Maybe that was the first moment I truly understood being home doesn't mean being taken for granted. Being home means being cherished. And I hadn't felt cherished in a very, very long time. I held off for as long as I could. I always did. I prided myself on being resourceful, on never burdening anyone, especially not my children. But when the leak started above the dining room window, small at first, just a stain, I knew I couldn't ignore it. A neighbor had told me that if I waited, the damage would spread. Mold, rot. I couldn't afford that, not with the cold months coming. I called a contractor for an estimate. The quote left me breathless. It wasn't outrageous, but it was more than I had in my current account, and dipping into my savings made me anxious. That money was supposed to be their inheritance, the safety net I'd promised them, even if I never said it aloud. I had planned so carefully, divided it fairly in my will. Each of them would get enough to feel secure. That had always been the plan. But that week Staring at the stain growing like a bruise across the wall, I swallowed my pride and reached out. I didn't ask for the full amount, just enough to help cover the labor, maybe the materials. I crafted the message with care, warm, polite, full of reassurances. Only if you're able. Just a small contribution. It would mean a lot. I sent it to all 3 of them in a group chat. The replies came one by one. My daughter-in-law responded first with, "Oh, no, that's awful timing. We're a bit tight this month, but hope you get it fixed quickly." Then my son chimed in, "Wish I could help, Mom. We've got the kids' school fees hitting all at once." The youngest didn't reply until the next day and only said, "Maybe next month, when I get my bonus." That was it. I sat at the kitchen table rereading the thread, my hands trembling ever so slightly. Not from rage, not even from sadness, but from something colder: humiliation, shame. Not because I needed the help, but because I had dared to ask and been met with distance. They didn't even try to discuss it. No follow-up. No, "How much do you need?" Just quick, clean exits from the conversation, like I was a spam email to be archived. I didn't reply. I couldn't. I felt a heat rising in my cheeks, the kind that used to come when I was scolded as a child for asking for seconds. I was 72, and yet I felt 12 again, small, needy, and ashamed of it. For days I avoided looking at the wall. I kept the curtains drawn, distracted myself with baking and rereading old novels. I told myself maybe they really were strapped for cash. Maybe I'd caught them at a bad time. But that same weekend, my daughter posted pictures of a weekend getaway wine, tasting a rented cabin with a hot tub. My son shared a video of his youngest at a birthday party complete with balloons and a hired magician, the youngest. She posted a photo from a fancy rooftop bar, the caption reading, "Treating myself because I deserve it." And maybe she did. Maybe they all did. But in that moment, something inside me shifted. It wasn't a break, not yet, but a shift, like the slow turning of soil after a long, silent frost. I wasn't even angry. I just saw them differently. I saw me differently. I had always thought of myself as the foundation beneath them, the one who held the cracks together, so they could build upward. But maybe all I had done was erase myself beneath their comfort. Later that week, I wrote the check for the contractor myself. I moved the funds from my savings without hesitation, though the ache in my chest lingered longer than the withdrawal notice on my screen. And then I did something I had never done before. I wrote it down. In my notebook, beneath a page filled with pressed violets from the garden, I scribbled a single sentence. "They let me carry them, but won't carry me." I closed the book gently and tucked it away. That night, I sat by the repaired window, watching the rain slide down the new pane. It didn't leak anymore. The contractor had done a good job. The house felt safe again. But inside me, the structure was changing. I wasn't angry. I wasn't planning revenge. But the storm had passed, and in the silence after, I finally heard myself say something I hadn't dared speak before. Maybe they don't deserve everything I've saved for them. It was my idea to have them all over that Sunday. I told them it had been too long since we'd sat together, just the 4 of us. I even hinted that I had something to discuss, hoping it would prompt curiosity or maybe concern. They agreed to come, though not without the usual caveats. My daughter asked if we could keep it short. She had a Pilates class. My son said he'd try not to be late. The youngest simply sent a thumbs-up emoji. I cleaned the house anyway, put out fresh flowers, brewed coffee, and set out a plate of shortbread cookies I had baked that morning. I don't know why I always do that. Prepare like it's a celebration even when I'm the one in pain. Maybe it's habit. Or maybe I still carry hope like an old brooch, pinned to the inside of my blouse where no one can see. They arrived in a flurry of movement and noise. Coats flung over chairs, shoes kicked off in the hallway. They talked over each other, barely noticing me at first. I smiled, offered drinks, and waited for the moment to begin. When we finally sat down around the coffee table, I folded my hands in my lap and began. I wanted to talk about something that's been on my heart, I said gently. I've been feeling overlooked, forgotten sometimes. I know everyone is busy, but... Before I could finish, my son leaned forward, half smiling. Mom, are you okay? You're not sick, are you? No, I said. Nothing like that. I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about how things have changed, how it feels when I ask for help and get silence, or when birthdays feel more like obligations than celebrations. My daughter-in-law exchanged a glance with my son. My youngest rolled her eyes ever so slightly and took out her phone. I pressed on softly, but clearly. I'm not trying to blame anyone. I just want to understand why it feels like I'm the only one still trying, why the balance is so off. My daughter spoke up first. Mom, we do try, but you have to understand we have a lot on our plates. Kids, work, bills. It's not personal. It may not be personal to you, I replied, but it's personal to me. That silenced them for a beat. My youngest scoffed. This is about the inheritance, isn't it? You're worried we're expecting too much. I blinked. No, but it's telling that you brought that up. They all started talking at once after that. Assurances, defensiveness, promises they'd do better, jokes to diffuse the tension. But it wasn't noise that bothered me. It was the tone. Patronizing. Dismissive. They treated me like a child acting out for attention. One even said, maybe you just need a hobby. A hobby. As if the ache in my chest was boredom, not betrayal. I ended the conversation soon after that, told them I appreciated their time, walked them to the door, hugged them each like it was the last time. They left quickly. My daughter even looked at her watch as she said goodbye. My son patted my shoulder like I'd made a fuss over nothing. When the door finally clicked shut behind them, I stood in the foyer for a long time, staring at the empty coat hooks. The silence was different this time, not lonely, but illuminating. I had always believed that love would eventually circle back, that if I just held on a little longer, they'd remember the woman who held them through every fever, every heartbreak, every mistake. But they didn't see me that way anymore. They saw me as old, as dramatic, as background. I made tea and sat with my notebook again. My pen hovered for a moment before I wrote. When I finally spoke, they didn't listen. They managed me, like I was a problem to fix, not a mother with a heart that was breaking. I folded the page gently and whispered to myself, so this is what it feels like when love goes unreturned. That night, I didn't cry. I cleaned the cups they barely touched. I put away the cookies, and as I slid the box of shortbread into the pantry, I realized I was done baking for people who only come when they're hungry, not when I'm hurting. I hadn't brought it up, not once. The idea that they were waiting on the inheritance had always hovered in the background like a whisper you pretend not to hear. I told myself I was imagining it, that surely they wouldn't think that way. But after that family meeting, after watching their faces flicker with discomfort and calculation, when I merely hinted at feeling neglected, the truth started rising slow and sharp like a thorn from beneath the skin. It happened during a phone call just a few days later. My son had called surprisingly ostensibly to check in, but the conversation wandered. He asked how I was feeling, if I was still dwelling on last weekend, and then he said it as casually as someone might comment on the weather, just, "Don't do anything drastic, okay? You know, with the will or whatever, we're all counting on that one day." Counting on it. He said it without shame, without hesitation, like it was some shared understanding, an unspoken transaction carved in stone, as if my life's work, my savings, my modest home, my investments, all those quiet sacrifices were simply a pot of gold they'd been waiting to split when I was no longer here. I kept my voice steady. What makes you so sure it's yours to count on? There was a pause on the line, then a laugh light but strained. Well, I mean, of course it's yours, but we just assumed you know that it'd go to us eventually. It's only natural. Natural. As if love meant entitlement, as if biology signed a contract, as if a mother's only role in old age was to become a financial footnote in someone else's future. That night I sat in bed, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun lazily above me. I thought about all the times I had skipped vacations, worn old shoes, clipped coupons, just to keep that nest egg untouched. I thought about the little dreams I had quietly put away so theirs could grow freely. I never asked for much. I didn't want applause, but I had assumed naively that when the time came, they would want me, not what I left behind. It started to dawn on me that they had long since stopped seeing me as a person. I was now an institution, a figure of support, a placeholder, their safety net, their plan B. I remembered an article I once read in the newspaper about a woman who left her fortune to a public library instead of her children. The reporter had painted her as bitter eccentric, but I remember thinking at the time, or maybe she just finally realized who truly needed her. That thought followed me into the kitchen the next morning. I opened the pantry, looked at the shortbread box still sitting there from the failed meeting, and thought, I'm more than what I leave behind. Later that day, I took out my will from the filing cabinet. It was exactly as I had left it, 3 equal shares, clean and polite, fair, predictable. But as I stared at it, I felt nothing. No pride, no peace, just resignation. I put it back in the folder and pushed the drawer shut. It wasn't just about the money. It was about meaning. I had spent a lifetime giving them everything, not just financially, but emotionally, spiritually. And now the final act of my life, the inheritance, was supposed to be my last gift. But why give a gift to those who do not see you? Why feed a hunger that never once turned to ask, Are you full too, Mom? They were counting on it, but they had never counted me. That evening I found myself watching the news, but not really absorbing it. My eyes kept drifting to the notebook on the coffee table. I picked it up, flipped to a fresh page, and wrote, Love should not be a line item on someone else's spreadsheet. My legacy should not be measured in what they collect, but in what I choose to give to someone who still knows how to say, thank you. And in that moment, the quiet, pulsing idea that had been growing in me finally took shape. Maybe they weren't the right heirs. After that phone call, after hearing those words spoken so plainly, so thoughtlessly, something inside me began to turn. Not with rage, not with bitterness, but with something quieter, a slow, deliberate shift, like autumn creeping into the corners of summer, like the soft click of a door being gently, finally closed. I didn't confront them. I didn't send angry messages or bring it up again. No dramatic declarations, no tears, just a silence, a quiet pulling back. I stopped reaching out first. I stopped sending reminders about birthdays, anniversaries, and school concerts I'd never been invited to. I stopped offering to help. I stopped making myself available. I let the conversations go unanswered for a while, just to see what would happen. At first there was no reaction. Days passed, then a week, then 2. No calls, no texts. Not even a check-in to ask, "Are you okay?" And that's when I really knew what I had feared all along. I wasn't being missed. I wasn't being sought. I was only ever noticed when I was needed. It should have broken me. Years ago, it might have, but instead I felt something strange, almost sacred relief, like I had stopped treading water after years of drowning in silent expectations, like I could finally exhale without fearing the weight of being unappreciated. I found myself walking more, breathing deeper, sitting in the garden for longer stretches of time, watching the way the wind nudged the leaves, the way the sun poured itself over the stone bench I'd almost forgotten was there. I made soup for myself, not for guests, not for family, just me. I seasoned it just how I liked it. I lit a candle at dinner, even though I was alone, especially because I was alone. One morning I took a drive, not to run errands, but for the sake of movement. For the first time in years, I drove without a destination. I ended up near the edge of town, passing by the shelter I used to volunteer at when I was younger, when the children were still in school, and I had slivers of time to give elsewhere. The place looked the same, worn but alive, the windows still bright with hope. I parked across the street and just watched for a while. Women came in and out, holding children clutching bags, their faces tight with worry, but softened by relief as they stepped through those doors. It stirred something in me. I remembered how I used to bring warm meals, knit scarves, read stories to the little ones, while their mothers filled out forms and searched for jobs. I remembered how much I was seen there, how every smile, every whispered thank you felt more real than anything I'd received from my own blood in years. That night I couldn't sleep, not from sadness, but from something new possibility. What if my love didn't have to go to waste? What if my final act of giving could be chosen, not assumed? I started keeping track not of what they owed me, but of what I still had to offer the world. Time, wisdom, kindness, resources. And I realized with a sudden clarity that maybe the inheritance wasn't an obligation. Maybe it was a key, a chance to unlock something that mattered. So I waited. I waited to see if any of them would notice the quiet, if any would reach out, if the silence would be met with concern or just indifference. Weeks went by. There were messages occasionally, mostly updates, photos of the kids, forwarded memes, polite check-ins that felt like scheduled maintenance. But none of them said, "I miss you." None asked, "Are you happy?" None said, "I'm sorry." And so my shift deepened. I started sorting through my accounts, not out of vengeance, but out of freedom. I opened a new folder labeled Contingency. I began researching organizations again. Not charities with glossy ads, but the places that truly needed help. Places where money didn't just add to a pile, it changed lives. I knew I wasn't done giving. But I was done giving to those who only showed up with empty hands and shallow thanks. It arrived on a Thursday, tucked between a catalog and a utility bill. The envelope was thin and slightly smudged, addressed in pen by someone with careful, deliberate handwriting. I almost missed it. It had been years since I'd received a letter that wasn't printed by a machine or trying to sell me something I didn't need. I brought it inside and sat down at the kitchen table, sunlight spilling across the surface, like butter slowly melting on warm toast. When I opened it, I recognized the name immediately, Willow House Women's Shelter, the same place I had watched from across the street that day, the one I used to spend Tuesday afternoons at back when I still believed there would always be time to return. The letter was from one of the coordinators. She remembered me, said they had found my name while digitizing their old volunteer records. "You helped more than you knew," she wrote. "We still talk about the storybooks you brought in, the way the kids used to pile in your lap. Some of those little ones have children of their own now, and every once in a while someone asks about the lady who made Wednesday feel like Christmas." I read that line 3 times, tears blurring the ink until the words shimmered like a mirage. The lady who made Wednesday feel like Christmas. It had been so long since I felt seen, not as a mother, not as a provider, but as a person who gave something warm to the world and was remembered for it. She went on to explain that they were expanding the shelter. More women were coming in than ever before. Single mothers fleeing impossible situations, teenage girls with nowhere to go, women who had aged out of systems and slipped between the cracks. They had a plan but not enough resources. They weren't asking for money, just offering an update. But between the lines I could feel the quiet urgency, the same kind I once had in my voice when I asked my children for help with the roof and was met with silence. I placed the letter beside my tea and sat very still. It felt like something had been handed to me, invisible and delicate, like a new shape to the air, an invitation, a door I hadn't realized was still open. The next morning I drove to Willow House. The building hadn't changed much, the same chipped paint on the railing, the same patch of lavender still clinging stubbornly to life beside the stoop. Inside it smelled of coffee and fabric softener, and something older hope maybe buried beneath exhaustion. The coordinator greeted me with wide eyes and a hand over her mouth. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come," she said. We sat in the office for hours. She showed me around, introduced me to some of the women. One had just escaped an abusive partner with 2 toddlers in tow. Another had aged out of foster care and was working 2 jobs trying to afford her first apartment. Their stories were hard, raw, but each one reminded me of how much need still existed in the world and how far from that world my own family had drifted. These women didn't expect anything from me. They weren't performing politeness to secure a payout. They spoke openly, some shyly, but always honestly. One young mother hugged me without asking. Another handed me a beaded bracelet she'd made. "It's nothing fancy," she said, "just something to say thanks. People like you give me hope." I turned that bracelet over in my palm later that night, light pink beads strung on elastic barely fitting around my wrist, but it glowed with more gratitude than all the birthdays and Mother's Days I had spent waiting for phone calls that never came. That was the night the decision became real. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of recognition. The inheritance wasn't about money. It was about meaning, about choosing who gets to carry a piece of you forward, who deserves your final chapter, who will hold your story like a blessing, not an obligation. I began making the arrangements the next day. There was no storm in me that morning, no dramatic music playing in my mind, just a sense of calm that felt almost eerie, like the stillness before snow begins to fall. I dressed in my softest blouse, the one I used to save for church, and tied my hair back with a clip that had belonged to my mother. Then I gathered the folder, the one that had sat for years in the bottom drawer beneath layers of hope, and drove to the lawyer's office. The receptionist greeted me kindly, as she always did. "Good to see you again, Mrs. B," she said, not knowing this time would be different. My lawyer, Mr. Callahan, was a soft-spoken man with tired eyes and a desk covered in neatly stacked papers. We'd spoken many times before, updating small things in the will-reviewing property papers, but today I sat with a straighter spine. "I'd like to make changes to the will," I said. He glanced up, surprised. "Of course. What did you have in mind?" I took a breath, steady but full. I no longer wished to leave the inheritance to my children. The words hung there, heavy and alive. Mr. Callahan set down his pen slowly. "Are you sure?" he asked, not out of judgment, just the solemn duty of someone who knows the weight of final decisions. I nodded. "Yes. I've thought about it a long time. They have enough. What they don't have, I can no longer give." and what I still can give should go somewhere it will be needed, somewhere it will be cherished. We spoke for nearly 2 hours. I explained what I wanted, how I had chosen Willow House, how I had already begun discussions with the shelter about how the funds could be used, scholarships, emergency housing, job training programs. I wasn't just giving money. I was giving continuity. I was choosing a legacy built on hope instead of assumption. Mr. Callahan listened quietly, scribbling notes, occasionally glancing up to ask clarifying questions. At one point he paused, his brow furrowed. "Do you want them to know," he asked softly, "when the time comes?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted to leave no trace, to let the silence speak for itself. But another part, the part of me that had kept receipts and letters and folded school papers, wanted the truth to land, not to wound, but to wake. "Yes," I said at last. "Let them know, kindly, but clearly." We finished the paperwork, and I signed my name with a hand that did not tremble. When I left the office, the sun had broken through the clouds. The wind had picked up, and the trees along the sidewalk danced like children. I walked slowly, the folder tucked under my arm, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Not power, not defiance. Peace. I stopped at a small cafe on the way home, ordered a cup of chamomile tea, and sat by the window watching strangers come and go. A couple held hands. An old man fed pigeons. A young woman held a crying baby to her chest. Life was everywhere, unaware of my decision, uncaring about my quiet revolution, and yet I felt newly visible within it. I wasn't a footnote anymore. I was a woman reclaiming her voice in the final chapter of her life. And that chapter, I realized, could be the most honest one yet. Later that evening, I called Willow House again. I asked to speak with the director and told her I had made the changes official. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then tears. She didn't hide them. She didn't cover them up with formalities. She simply said, "You've changed lives today, and they'll never even know your name." I smiled. "That's all right. I know it." And that was enough. They held it quietly as I requested. No reporters, no press releases, no grand plaque with my name carved in stone. Just a modest luncheon in the garden, behind the shelter shaded by ivy-covered trellises and the quiet hum of summer insects. The air smelled of fresh bread and sunlight, and the folding chairs had little cushions tied to their backs, as if someone thought to care about comfort. That alone nearly brought me to tears. I wore lavender, not because it was dramatic, but because it reminded me of the flowers that once lined my old garden, the ones my husband used to tend. I arrived early, clutching the folder the lawyer had prepared, simple papers that held the weight of everything I'd spent my life building. Inside the shelter there was laughter, not the raucous, careless kind, but the soft, shy laughter of people learning how to breathe again after hardship. The kind of joy that doesn't need to be loud to be heard. The director greeted me with a hug that was firm and trembling all at once. "We're honored," she whispered, "not just for the money, but for the trust." Trust. That word wrapped around me like a quilt. I hadn't realized until that moment how much I'd needed to hear it. Not gratitude, not praise. Just the recognition that I was still capable of believing in something. That my love, redirected, could still bloom. The luncheon was simple. Quiche salad, lemon bars. They had printed a small program, though I had asked them not to. Still, I appreciated the gesture. One of the shelter's residents, a young woman with a soft voice and scars that ran deeper than her skin, stood and spoke. She told her story, of escape, of resilience, of how Willow House had given her and her daughter a bed, safety, and dignity. She didn't know my name, not yet, but her eyes found mine as she said, Whoever made this possible, thank you for seeing us. I clutched my napkin to my lips, trying to quiet the ache in my throat. I had spent decades waiting to hear words like that from children who had forgotten from family, who had taken. And now, here it was, in a stranger's voice, clearer and more sincere than I could have imagined. Later, they invited me to speak. I wasn't prepared, but I rose anyway, slow and careful, like drawing breath before a leap. I don't need to be remembered, I said gently. I just want to leave behind something that says, you mattered, not to those who assumed it, but to those who still know what it means. There was silence, not uncomfortable but full, weighted with emotion, and then a scattering of claps, not thunderous, not performative, just honest hands meeting in the middle of a warm afternoon. After the ceremony, I stayed behind, helped fold chairs, shared stories with volunteers. A little girl handed me a wilted dandelion and called it a wish flower. I closed my fingers around it and whispered, "Let this be the place where my love lives now." When I returned home that evening, the house was unchanged, quiet, still, but something inside me had been rearranged gently but permanently. I poured a glass of water, set the dandelion in an old jam jar, and placed it in the center of the kitchen table. No bouquets from my children, no cards, just that single yellow bloom, and it was enough. I sat down and opened my notebook. I turned to a new page and wrote, "Today I gave away everything they thought they owned, and in doing so I took back what was mine." There would be fallout, of course. One day when the news reached them, there would be angry calls, confusion, maybe even cruelty. But I wasn't afraid. I had already heard the loudest silence, the one that follows years of being taken for granted. Everything else was just noise. And beneath that noise now lived something quieter, steadier. A legacy not built on blood, but on choice. It didn't take long. Just over 2 weeks from the day I signed the documents, the first call came. I saw my son's name flash across the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it ring. But I answered quietly, calmly, as if I didn't already know what was coming. "Mom," he said, breathless, sharp around the edges, "did you really change the will?" So he had found out. I imagined the moment perhaps while rifling through my papers during a casual visit, or maybe through some legal grapevine word passed from someone who thought he had a right to know. However it came, it didn't matter. It was out now. The truth was breathing between us. "Yes," I said. There was silence, then a forced laugh, like he couldn't quite believe I'd said it aloud. "You're kidding. You wouldn't do that to your own kids." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't tremble. I didn't do anything to you. I simply did something for someone else. He grew angry quickly. Accusations spilled about fairness, about betrayal, about how, after everything, this was how I repaid them. I let him speak. Let the storm run through the phone and crash like waves on a cliff that no longer cared to crumble. When he paused, waiting for a fight, I simply said I gave to where I was needed, where I felt seen. He hung up. The others followed one after the next. My youngest called me cruel. My daughter emailed a long message titled, "This isn't right," full of words like legacy and expectation and family duty. They all used the word deserve. Not once did they say love. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Instead, I cleaned the kitchen. I watered the plants. I sat in the stillness of a home that no longer echoed with the footsteps of people who only came when something was broken. Over the next week, packages arrived, empty gestures sent in haste. Flowers from my daughter, a gift basket from my son-in-law, a handwritten card that read, more like a script. "We're sorry if you felt neglected. We love you. If. Felt. I placed them on the counter and didn't reply. They weren't apologies. They were protests. Not of love, but of loss. Loss of access, of assumed entitlement. None of them asked why. None of them said, "Tell me how you've been." They just reacted. They reacted to what had been taken, never once considering why. I felt the need to take it back. The shelter sent a different kind of message. A small envelope handwritten with a photo tucked inside. 3 women smiling in front of a new bunk room. A sign above them read, "The Rose Room." I hadn't asked for them to name anything after me, but they had, because they wanted to. I held that photo in my hands and let it warm me. That weekend I baked bread, not for company, not for a holiday, just because the house smelled lonely, and I wanted to remind it that comfort still lived here. I sliced it warm, buttered it generously, and sat by the window while it rained. The soft kind of rain that soaks the earth without flooding it, the kind that nurtures. I thought of the word deserve, how they clung to it like it was proof of something sacred. But love doesn't live in deserve. Love lives in attention, in listening, in showing up not once, not just when you want something, but consistently when it's hard, when it's quiet, when nothing is owed. But everything is offered anyway. They hadn't called again. Maybe they would. Maybe they wouldn't. But either way, I had already begun to rewrite the definition of family, not as those who share your blood, but those who water your roots. My birthday came around again 1 year after the dinner that changed everything. 73 candles this time, though I didn't bother lighting them. I didn't bake a cake, didn't set the table for guests who might not come. Instead, I made a single slice of lemon loaf, soft, just a touch sweet, and placed it on my best china. The fine porcelain with the gold edge, the one I used to save for company. Today I decided I was company enough. I dressed slowly that morning, ironed my blouse, brushed my hair until it gleamed silver in the light. I took my time with lipstick, paused. When I caught my reflection, really looked at her. The woman in the mirror didn't seem angry, didn't look vengeful or triumphant. She looked calm, like someone who had finally remembered how to breathe with her whole chest. The calls did come eventually. My daughter left a voicemail. "Hope you're having a great birthday. Sorry we couldn't make it over. The kids have sports. Love you." My son sent a picture of a chocolate cake store-bought, probably captioned, "This reminded me of yours, the youngest." A text with a gif of balloons and the words, "Happy birthday, Mama," beneath it. I didn't respond. I didn't feel the need to. Because for the first time in decades, I didn't spend the day waiting for the doorbell, waiting for conversation, waiting to feel like more than an afterthought. Instead, I sat in the garden watching the bees drift lazily through the lavender and let the sunlight kiss the back of my hand like an old friend. I thought about all I'd given years, energy, sleepless nights, and yes, money. I thought about the storage room now half empty, the closet that no longer housed the weight of unacknowledged labor. And I thought of Willow House, the photo, the plaque, the new bunk beds that now carried women who once had no place to lay their heads. They knew my name there, not just because it was written in ink, but because it had been offered with purpose. Later that evening, I sat at the piano. My fingers moved slowly across the keys, rusty, but remembering. I played the lullaby I used to hum when they were babies. Funny how the hands remember what the heart forgets. I didn't cry. I just let the notes carry me somewhere soft and old, where the ache of being unappreciated faded under the rhythm of enough. Before bed, I lit a candle, not for prayer, not for ritual, just to witness the way a single flame can warm an entire room. And as I turned back the sheets, I whispered to the quiet. I gave them a lifetime, but I get to choose how the story ends. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to remember my worth. Some endings are just beginnings with the noise turned off. I gave them silence, and in it I found peace. And so here I am, no longer waiting for calls that never come, no longer baking for mouths that never said thank you, no longer saving money for people who never saved space for me. There is a strange kind of beauty in becoming invisible. It strips away the noise. It shows you who clings and who contributes. It reveals the truth not with cruelty, but with clarity. And once you see it, you can't go back. But you can go forward. Forward into rooms where you are wanted, into causes that remember your name, into small ordinary joys that don't demand a performance in return. A cup of tea on the porch, a handwritten letter from a shelter child who still believes in miracles, the sound of rain steady and soft tapping on clean glass. This is not a sad ending. This is a return, a remembering. Not of what was taken, but of what remains. Dignity, kindness, self-respect. I no longer dream of big family gatherings or long apologies. I no longer wait for their recognition to validate my life, because I've realized something simple and sacred. Love given freely is a gift, but love expected demanded, without offering anything back. That is no love at all. And so I let go. I let go of the will they assumed was theirs. I let go of the silence I once used to measure their care. And in that letting go, I found the one thing they could never give me. Peace. The kind that doesn't require an audience. The kind that lives quietly, like a candle in the dark. Still burning. Still mine.